The sound was small, a sharp crack of ceramic against concrete. But in the breathless quiet of the sub-basement, it struck with the violence of a gunshot. A single brick, loosened by a vibration no one else had felt, slid from the wall and shattered on the floor. Thomas froze, his hand tightening on the handle of his mop. Then came the smell. It drifted from the dark gap in the masonry, invisible and heavy. It wasn't the familiar scent of dust or floor wax that defined his nights. It was the smell of air that had been entombed, dry, cold, and stale. Thomas stood alone in the dim light, looking at the jagged hole in the foundation. He knew every inch of these blueprints. He knew what was supposed to be behind that wall. Solid earth. Clay. The hill the nation was built upon. But as the stale draft washed over his face, carrying the taste of ancient, uncirculated dust, he realized the blueprints were a lie. What lay behind the wall wasn't just a room. It was a truth the building had kept hidden since the first stone was laid. 3 a.m. at the Capitol is a ghost hour. The tourists are gone, the politicians are sleeping, and the frantic energy of the news cycle has finally burned itself out. What remains is the heavy, oppressive silence of a building that weighs millions of tons. Down here, in the sub-basement, the air is thick with the hum of massive HVAC systems, a mechanical lung that breathes for the complex above. The weight of the marble floors, the statues, and the great dome itself feels palpable, pressing down through the support columns. Thomas loved this time. For 20 years he had walked these corridors, a custodian of the quiet. He wasn't just cleaning floors. He was listening to the bones of the structure. He knew the building's language. He knew which pipes rattled when the heat kicked on in November. He knew which floor tiles near the archives were loose, shifting with a soft click under his work boots. He respected the structure, treating the limestone and granite with the care one might give to an elderly relative. Tonight, however, the rhythm was broken. He had been called down for a routine check. A persistent damp spot reported near the north foundation wall. It should have been simple. A sweating pipe, a crack in a drain line. But as Thomas approached the end of the corridor, the atmosphere shifted. The air here felt different. It was sharper, colder, cutting through the tepid, recycled warmth of the ventilation system. He stopped 10 feet from the wall. The dampness was there, a dark stain spreading across the whitewashed brick like a bruise. But it wasn't right. There was no dripping pipe above it, no condensation lines running down from the ceiling. The moisture seemed to be pushing through the stone itself, sweating out from the pores of the material. He stepped closer, his flashlight beam cutting a stark white cone through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, swirling in a pattern that didn't make sense. They were being pulled. A draft. A steady, faint current of air was seeping through the solid wall. Thomas frowned. He knew the layout. Behind this wall was 20 feet of compacted soil, then the retaining wall, then the earth of Capitol Hill. There was no space for wind. There was no space for air to move. He reached out, placing his palm flat against the damp brick. It was freezing. Not the cool touch of a basement wall, but the biting, deep earth cold of a cave. He tapped the brick with his knuckles. Thud. Solid. He moved his hand 6 inches to the right, to the center of the stain. He tapped again. Thock. The sound was unmistakable. It was the hollow, wooden note of a void. Thomas pulled his hand back as if the wall had bitten him. A hollow sound in a foundation wall meant one of two things: structural failure or a space that wasn't on the map. He didn't panic. He was a professional. He reached for his belt and unclipped a heavy-duty scraper. He needed to see the brickwork beneath the paint and plaster. He needed to know if the mortar had simply rotted away, leaving a gap for the earth to settle. He pressed the metal edge against the wall. Shh. The paint curled away in wet strips. Shh. He dug deeper, into the plaster layer. It was soft, degraded by years of hidden moisture. He worked methodically, clearing a square foot of space. The debris fell to the floor with wet splats, dirtying his boots. When the gray, rough-hewn surface of the underlying brick was exposed, Thomas stopped. These weren't the standard red clay bricks used in the 1800s renovation. These were older, darker. They looked like they had been cut from river stone. And the mortar between them wasn't cement. It was a crumbling, sandy grit that disintegrated under the pressure of his thumb. He shined the light closer. The draft was stronger now, without the plaster to seal it. It hissed softly, a whisper from the dark. He wedged the corner of his scraper into the mortar joint of the central brick. He didn't have to pry hard. The binding agent had turned to powder decades ago. The brick was loose. He wiggled it. Grating stone echoed in the silent hallway. He pulled. The heavy block slid free, scraping against its neighbors, and fell into his other hand. He stared at the hole he had made. He expected to see the brown packing of dirt. He expected to see the rusted iron of an old pipe. He saw nothing. His flashlight beam hit the opening and vanished. It didn't reflect off a back wall. It didn't catch on roots or soil. It extended into a darkness that was absolute. The draft exhaled over him, full force now, smelling of wet iron and time. He wasn't looking at a maintenance crawlspace. He was looking into a void that defied the very geography of the hill. Thomas stood frozen, the heavy brick in his hand, realizing that the silence of the night shift had just been broken forever. Thomas didn't stop. He couldn't. The hole was the size of a fist, but the darkness behind it felt like an ocean pressing against a porthole. He worked the metal scraper deep into the crumbling mortar of the adjacent bricks. They came loose with terrifying ease. It was as if the wall had been waiting for him, the tension in the masonry gone. He pulled a second brick free, then a third. They clattered to the concrete floor, the sound harsh and intrusive. With a gap now the width of his shoulders, the true nature of the anomaly hit him. It wasn't just a draft. It was an exhale. The basement was breathing out. The pressure differential popped his ears as the sealed atmosphere rushed into the corridor. It carried a scent that made him gag, not rot, but a metallic, sterile sharpness. It smelled like ozone and wet slate, like the air after a thunderstorm preserved in a jar for 200 years. It was the smell of a place where nothing had lived for a very long time. Thomas clicked his flashlight to its highest setting. He leaned forward, bracing his hand against the cold edges of the broken wall, and thrust the beam into the void. He expected the light to catch the back of a retaining wall, or the wooden shoring of an old construction tunnel. Instead, the light just went. The beam cut a solid, bright white cone through the floating dust, stretching out 50 feet before fading into nothingness. There was no back wall, no ceiling. The floor fell away sharply into a black abyss. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, hidden behind a layer of brick. The scale of it made him dizzy. The massive building above him suddenly felt fragile, a paperweight resting on a thin sheet of glass over a deep well. He felt impossibly small. It was the fear that hits you when you swim over a drop-off in the ocean. He felt watched, not by eyes, but by the space itself. The silence inside the void was completely different than the silence in the hallway. It was heavy. It had mass. It pressed against his face, cold and indifferent. Then, he saw it. He swept the light down, searching for the bottom, and the beam caught an edge. It wasn't rock. It was a line, perfectly straight, carved from a stone darker than the surrounding gloom. Thomas squinted, his heart hammering. He traced the line upward. It was a corner. A massive hewn block of black stone joined seamlessly to another. He moved the light further. The structure emerged from the dark like a ghost ship. It was a pillar, thick as a redwood, rising from the depths. But the style was wrong. It wasn't the neoclassical marble of DC. It wasn't colonial brick. This was something else. The surface was etched with deep geometric channels, lines that turned at right angles, running in patterns that looked like circuitry. It looked industrial, yet ancient. A monolith built to last for 10,000 years without decaying. Thomas stared at the carving. The dust motes swirled around it. This wasn't a forgotten basement. This was architecture. Someone had built this. Someone had stood down here in the dark and carved that stone with a precision modern tools would struggle to match. And then, someone else had built a wall to hide it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The damp spot wasn't a leak. It was the void clashing with the outside. The building wasn't settling into the earth. It was perched on top of this thing. He stepped back, boots scraping on the concrete. The sound was too loud. He felt like an intruder in a tomb. He looked at the hole, then at the darkness, then at the flashlight shaking in his hand. This was beyond him, beyond maintenance, beyond the blueprints. He reached for the radio on his belt. His fingers felt clumsy. He didn't want to break the silence that belonged to the thing behind the wall. But he knew he had to. He pressed the button, the plastic click echoing like a gunshot. "Control," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Control, this is Unit 4. You need to send someone down here. Now." He released the button and waited, staring at the black void, knowing the quiet life he knew was over. The radio crackled, a burst of white noise that seemed too loud in the heavy quiet. Thomas didn't release the button immediately. He held it down, listening to the dead air, his thumb trembling against the plastic. He was a man who fixed leaks and replaced light bulbs. He didn't report anomalies. He didn't report impossible geography. "Unit 4, say again?" The dispatcher's voice was tinny, bored, stripped of all urgency. It was the voice of a man sitting in a bright, warm room with coffee and monitors, a world away from the cold draft spilling out of the wall. "I said," Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. "I have a breach in the North Foundation, sub-level 3. It's not a pipe, Control. The wall is gone." There was a pause. "Gone? You mean collapsed?" "I mean it opens up," Thomas whispered, eyes locked on the darkness. "There's something behind it. Send security. Send everyone." He dropped the radio to his belt. He didn't move. He stood guard over the hole like a sentinel at the gates of the underworld, afraid that if he turned his back, the darkness would spill out and swallow the corridor. 5 minutes later, heavy boots echoed off the concrete. 2 officers, Miller and Jenkins, rounded the corner. They looked annoyed, hands resting loosely on their belts, expecting a water main break. They slowed down when they saw Thomas. He was pale, covered in brick dust, standing perfectly still. Then they slowed down, because they felt it. The air from the hole hit them 20 feet out. Miller stopped, sniffing. He frowned. It smelled like a thunderstorm trapped underground. He unclipped his flashlight and walked forward, annoyance replaced by sharp tension. "What is this, Tom?" Miller asked, voice low. "Don't get too close," Thomas warned. Miller ignored him. He stepped up to the jagged opening and shined his light inside. He swept the beam left, then right, then down. He waited for the light to hit a wall. When it didn't, He leaned in further, squinting. He saw the pillar. He saw the black, carved stone rising from the abyss. Miller pulled back sharply, hand going to his radio. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Central," Miller said, voice tight. "We have a situation red in Sector 4. Secure the perimeter. I need the supervisor down here. Now." They didn't enter. Instinct took over. You don't walk into a cave that shouldn't exist. They pulled yellow tape from their belts, stringing it across the hallway, creating a fragile barrier between the modern world and the ancient one. They stood with their backs to the tape, facing the corridor, weapons unholstered but lowered. They weren't guarding the building from intruders anymore. They were guarding it from the basement. The supervisor arrived 10 minutes later. He took one look at the void, one look at the carvings on the pillar, and he didn't call the police. He walked 50 feet up the hallway, took out a cell phone, and dialed a number that wasn't in his contacts. He recited a code. "Containment is set," he said. "North Foundation. Anomaly confirmed. It's deep." He hung up and turned to the guards. "This is a gas leak," he said, voice flat. "A main line rupture. Hazardous fumes. We are locking down the sublevels. No one comes down here. No one sees this." The order moved up the chain like a virus. In the control room, screens flashed from green to amber. Silent alarms tripped in the upper corridors. Heavy magnetic locks slammed shut on stairwell doors, sealing the basement off from the rotunda above. The building began to tighten, closing its eyes and ears. Over the PA system, a recorded voice announced the minor ventilation issue, asking non-essential staff to clear lower floors. It was a smooth, efficient lie. Thomas watched from the side of the hallway. He saw the fear in the supervisor's eyes. He saw the way the guards refused to look back at the hole. They were trying to bury it again. They were going to seal it up and pretend the black stone pillar didn't exist. But it was too late. Outside, on the empty streets of D.C., the response had already begun. There were no sirens. Sirens were for fires and crimes. This was neither. 3 black SUVs turned the corner onto the service ramp, moving with the quiet, predatory speed of sharks. They didn't have markings. They didn't need them. They bypassed the security checkpoint without stopping, the gates rising automatically as they approached. The specialists had arrived. And they weren't here to fix a wall. The doors of the black SUVs didn't slam. They clicked shut with the heavy, sealed thud of armored plating. The men and women who stepped onto the loading dock weren't wearing the tactical vests of a SWAT team or the crisp uniforms of the Secret Service. They wore gray field jackets, durable cargo pants, and boots dusted with the clay of other excavation sites. They moved with a synchronization that made the regular security guards look like amateurs. This wasn't a raid. It was a surgery. Leading them was a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. Dr. Eris Thorne didn't walk with the swagger of a federal agent. He walked with the careful, testing gait of someone used to unstable ground. He was the head of a forensic architecture unit that didn't exist on any public payroll. Thorne didn't fix buildings. He autopsied them. He found the rooms that had been bricked up for political convenience and the tunnels that didn't appear on the blueprints. When he saw the yellow tape and the pale guards, he didn't ask for a report. He just tweaked his glasses and nodded, as if confirming a diagnosis he had already made from the surface. Behind him, the team began unloading cases. These weren't standard toolboxes. They were pelican cases the size of coffins, stamped with warnings about magnetic interference and radiation. They carried them into the service elevator without a word, the wheels rumbling over the linoleum like distant thunder. Ground-penetrating radar units. LiDAR scanners, capable of mapping a cavern to the millimeter in pitch blackness. air quality sniffers that could detect a single molecule of ancient decay. Down in the sub-basement, the transformation was immediate and total. The hallway, usually the domain of mops, silence, and the smell of floor wax, became a nerve center. Cables snaked across the floor like black vines, taped down with aggressive precision. Monitors flickered to life, bathing the damp walls in a harsh, clinical blue glow. They unplugged the vending machine to power a server rack. The team didn't speak. They used hand signals and sharp nods. They treated the hole in the wall not as a construction defect, but as a biological wound. Something that could get infected, or something that could bite back. Thomas was still standing near his mop bucket, feeling like a ghost in his own workplace. The security supervisor had ignored him, treating him as a liability to be managed. But Thorne walked straight to him. He didn't look at Thomas's ID badge. He looked at his hands, still coated in the gray dust of the crumbled mortar. "The vibration," Thorne said. His voice was gravel, low and direct. He didn't introduce himself. He just started the work. "Did you feel it in your feet, or did you feel it in your teeth?" Thomas blinked, surprised to be seen. I don't know. It was just a shake, like a truck passing." Thorne shook his head, his eyes scanning Thomas's face with an intensity that was uncomfortable. "No, a truck shakes the floor. This shakes the air." "Did the silence hurt your ears before the brick fell?" The question hung in the air, absurd and terrifying. Thomas wanted to say no. He wanted to say it was just a draft. But he remembered the pressure. He remembered the feeling of the basement holding its breath. "Yes," Thomas whispered. "It felt heavy, like the air was pressing in." Thorne didn't mock him. He didn't smile. He just wrote something down in a small, weathered notebook. "Good. You're attuned to it. Stay close," he said, turning back to the void. "You opened the door. The room remembers you now." The comment sent a chill through Thomas that had nothing to do with the cold draft. These people weren't just engineers, they were excavators of the impossible. They knew that the Capitol wasn't just a building, it was a capstone. They acted like bomb squad technicians approaching a live wire, except the wire was made of stone and history. The tension in the hallway was brittle. Every member of Thorne's team kept glancing at the black void, their movements tight, their breathing controlled. They were afraid. Not of the dark, but of what they knew lived inside it. A technician called out from a bank of monitors, her face illuminated by a scrolling feed of data. "Emitters are placed. Array is hot. We have signal lock." Thorne pulled on a pair of thick, insulated gloves. He signaled to the team. The hallway lights were killed, leaving only the blue glow of the screens and the white beams of the flashlights pointing into the abyss. The silence returned, but this time it was electric. The machines were ready to see through the stone. They were ready to strip away the skin of the hill and look at the skeleton underneath. The process began not with a bang, but with a low, rhythmic grinding that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The technicians moved the ground-penetrating radar sleds across the basement floor in slow, overlapping sweeping motions, like gardeners mowing a lawn made of concrete. But the sound wasn't the mechanical whir of a motor. It was the high-pitched electronic whine of the emitters firing millions of radar pulses into the earth every second. The air in the hallway grew warm as the server racks hummed, processing the raw data in real time. Thomas stood against the far wall, watching the monitors. He didn't understand the physics of what they were doing, but he understood the tension. The screen wasn't showing the familiar jagged static of soil and rock. It was showing nothing. For the first few minutes, the display was a wash of dark blue noise, a visual representation of a signal falling into a void and finding nothing to bounce off of. "Adjust the gain," Thorne commanded, his voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. "We're not punching deep enough. The signal is dissipating before it hits the back wall." "I'm at max gain, Doctor," the lead technician replied, her fingers flying across a keyboard. "The signal isn't dissipating, it's traveling. There's just nothing to hit. It's empty space." Thorne moved closer to the main screen. "It can't be empty. The building is resting on something. Physics demands it. Switch to the LiDAR array. Map the void through the breach." They reoriented the equipment. A tripod-mounted laser scanner was positioned carefully at the edge of the hole Thomas had made. When they activated it, a spinning mirror inside the device turned into a blur, firing a laser beam into the darkness 300,000 times a second. On the central monitor, a point cloud began to form. It looked like a ghostly three-dimensional photograph developing in a darkroom. First, the jagged edges of the brick wall appeared in bright green. Then, the immediate darkness beyond began to fill with millions of tiny dots, sketching out the shape of the invisible world. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the soft whir of the spinning laser. As the scanner pushed deeper, the dots didn't form the chaotic organic shapes of a natural cavern. They formed lines. Perfectly straight, vertical lines that stretched down into the abyss. Then, right angles. Then, arches. "That's not a tunnel," Thorne whispered, the color draining from his face. The image resolved further, panning down. The floor of the void wasn't 10 feet down. It wasn't 20. The data showed a drop of nearly 400 feet. And rising from that floor, filling the cavern like a ship in a bottle, were structures. Massive, monolithic towers of stone reached up toward the underside of the Capitol's foundation. They were arranged in a grid, separated by wide avenues that mirrored the layout of a major metropolis. The scanner mapped the surface of the nearest structure, a sheer wall of dark stone that rose 300 feet without a single window. The surface was covered in the same intricate, circuitry-like carvings Thomas had seen on the pillar, but on a scale that was dizzying. "It's a skyline," the technician said, her voice trembling. "We are looking at the roof of a city." Thorne leaned in, tracing the lines on the screen with a shaking finger. "Look at the geometry. That's not Roman. It's not Greek. It's not Masonic." He looked at the depth readings. "This architecture, it's bearing the weight of the hill. The Capitol isn't sitting on the earth. It's sitting on the roof of this place." The implication settled over the room like a lead blanket. The scale was impossible. The structures below them dwarfed the building they were standing in. The Capitol, with all its marble and history, was merely a small, decorative capstone placed over a much older, much darker engine. "Is it inhabited?" Thomas asked. The question felt loud in the quiet room. Thorne looked at the thermal readings. "The stone is cold. Ambient temperature matches the earth. But look here." He pointed to the base of the towers, where the scanner had picked up a network of large cylindrical conduits. "These aren't for people. They're for power, or water, or something fluid." He turned to the team. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by a raw, primal awe. "This stone shows signs of geological pressure consistent with the last ice age. This city wasn't built secretly in the 1800s. It was here when the glaciers retreated. It was here when the first settlers arrived. We just built on top of it." The monitors flickered as the scanner completed its pass, leaving a frozen, glowing green image of a necropolis beneath the nation's capital. The silence in the hallway was total. They were no longer standing in a government building. They were standing on the lid of a jar that had been sealed for 10,000 years. Thorne straightened up, his eyes hard. He looked at the hole in the wall, then at his team. "We can't map this from the doorway," he said, his voice resolving into a command. "Get the breaching gear. We're going inside." The transition from observation to intrusion began with the zip of a suit and the click of a respirator. The hallway, once a place of quiet maintenance, had become a staging ground for an expedition into the underworld. Thorne's team didn't rush. They moved with the grim finality of soldiers preparing for a drop behind enemy lines. They handed Thomas a suit, heavy, rubberized, and smelling of industrial talc. He didn't ask why he was going. He didn't have to. When Thorne looked at him, the unspoken understanding was clear. Thomas had opened the door, and the thing downstairs was already aware of him. Leaving now would feel like running away from a predator that had already picked up your scent. The air inside the suits was sterile, filtered, and detached, separating them from the basement's damp chill. But even through the layers of protective gear, Thomas could feel the pressure change. The atmosphere bleeding out of the hole wasn't just old, it was heavy with particulates that didn't register on standard sensors. Dust from a time before the city above had a name. The widening of the breach was a violent affair. 2 technicians with diamond-tipped concrete saws stepped up to the wall. The screaming whine of the blades tore through the silence, kicking up clouds of red brick dust that swirled in the harsh work lights. They weren't just cutting a door, they were amputating a limb of the capital's history. Brick by brick, the facade of the 19th century was peeled away, revealing the jagged, tooth-like edges of the bedrock behind it. When the dust finally settled, a rectangular maw, 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, stood open. It was a portal. On one side lay the linoleum, the fluorescent lights, and the known world. On the other, a darkness so complete it seemed to have a physical texture. "Stay on the gantry," Thorne commanded, his voice crackling through the comms in Thomas's earpiece. "Do not touch the walls unless necessary. We don't know if they're stable, and we don't know if they're dormant." They deployed a portable metal walkway, extending it through the hole until it locked onto the ledge of the ancient structure. Thomas took the 3rd position in the line, sandwiched between 2 specialists carrying heavy sensor arrays. He stepped over the pile of broken modern bricks and placed his boot on the metal grate. Crossing that threshold felt like stepping off the edge of the earth. The moment he passed the plane of the wall, the acoustics vanished. In the hallway, the saws had echoed, the voices had reverberated. Here, sound simply died. It was a dead, flat silence that swallowed noise instantly. His own breathing sounded loud and harsh in his ears, isolated and claustrophobic. There was no echo. The space was too vast, or perhaps the material of the walls was designed to absorb sound, to keep secrets. A technician fired a flare gun. The magnesium star hissed, arching out into the black. It fell and fell and fell. For 6 long seconds, it dropped before sparking out against a distant floor. The depth was dizzying. They weren't just in a basement, they were suspended near the ceiling of a buried cathedral the size of Manhattan. Then, the floodlights kicked on. The portable stadium lights, mounted on the walkway, bathed the nearest structure in a stark, white glare. A collective gasp hissed through the comms channel. They were standing on a ledge overlooking a canyon, but the canyon walls were artificial. Directly in front of them, rising from the dark like the spine of a sleeping god, was a monolith. It was made of a stone that drank the light, a seamless, veinless black material that looked more like solidified shadow than rock. It wasn't a cave formation. It was brutalist architecture on a galactic scale. The surface was smooth, polished to a mirror sheen that had survived glaciers and time without a scratch. But it wasn't empty. As Thomas squinted against the glare, he saw the carvings. They weren't decorative. They were functional. Deep, geometric channels ran vertically down the face of the monolith, interlocking like the traces on a circuit board. They were vast, each line thick enough for a man to stand in. "It's not just a building," Thorn's voice whispered in his ear, stripped of its usual clinical detachment. "It's a machine." Thomas looked down. The light revealed the tops of other structures below. Blocky, windowless towers arranged in perfect mathematical grids. It was a city of silence, preserved in a vacuum of stone. There was no debris, no rubble. It didn't look ruined. It looked paused. It looked as if the inhabitants had simply turned off the lights and left an hour ago, leaving the machinery to hum quietly in the dark. The feeling of intrusion was physical. The air here felt thick, resistant to their movement, as if the space itself resented their presence. It was a sacred, forbidden atmosphere, the kind of feeling you get when you walk into a house where something terrible has just happened, and the violence is still hanging in the air. "We're going down," Thorn said, signaling the team forward. They began the descent, moving from the safety of the metal gantry onto the ancient stone steps that spiraled down the side of the nearest tower. Thomas placed a gloved hand on the wall to steady himself. Through the thick rubber, he felt a vibration. It wasn't a tremor, it was a rhythm, a slow, deep pulse, beating at the same frequency as a human heart, but infinitely slower. The city wasn't dead, it was sleeping. And as they descended into its throat, Thomas had the terrifying certainty that they were about to wake it up. They reached the floor of the cavern. The metal walkway ended and their boots made contact with the pavement. It wasn't concrete. It was a fused, glass-like composite that felt unnervingly smooth beneath their heavy tread. Thorn checked his compass. The needle snapped to north. Perfect, unwavering north. The avenue stretched out into the darkness, wide enough to land an airliner, and it aligned perfectly with the corridors of the Capitol 300 feet above. This wasn't a coincidence. The city above hadn't just been built on a hill. It had been built on a template. They moved forward, their floodlights carving a tunnel of visibility through the gloom. The buildings on either side were fortresses of silence. They had no doors at ground level, no windows, no recognizable entrances. They were massive, rectangular blocks of the same light-drinking stone, rising hundreds of feet into the dark. The carvings Thomas had seen earlier were everywhere here. They wrapped around the corners of the structures, intricate geometric channels that looked less like art and more like a schematic. It was a city designed by a mind that didn't care about sunlight or views. It cared about connection. Thomas fell into step beside Thorn. As a custodian, Thomas had spent 20 years fighting dust. He knew how fast it accumulated. A room left closed for a week grew a gray film. A basement left for a year grew a fur coat of particulate matter. But here, in a cavern that had been sealed for millennia, the surfaces were immaculate. He ran his gloved finger along a low retaining wall. It came away clean. "There's no dust," Thomas whispered, his voice sounding thin in the vastness. "How is there no dust?" Thorn didn't answer immediately. He was looking at a series of grates set into the base of a tower. They weren't air intakes. They were angled downward, feeding into the bedrock. "This place isn't dormant," Thorn murmured, aiming his thermal scanner at the vents. "It's active. It's filtering the air. It's maintaining its own sterility. We aren't walking through a ruin, Thomas. We're walking through a clean room." The team continued deeper. They passed aqueducts that didn't carry water, but instead housed thick bundles of metallic cables that had oxidized to a deep, bruised purple. They found ventilation shafts that plunged into the earth, suggesting that what they were seeing, this massive city, was only the upper level of something even deeper. Thorne stopped at the corner of a particularly massive structure. He shined his light on a stress fracture in the stone. "Look at the compression," he said, tracing the crack. "This isn't settling damage. This is geological loading. See how the rock has fused here? That takes pressure over time. Thousands of years of pressure. This structure was already old when the glaciers covered this region. When the first humans walked across the land bridge, this place was already waiting." The idea was too big to hold. A pre-Ice Age metropolis sitting beneath the seat of modern democracy. But it was Thomas who found the detail that made the scale manageable. He had stopped in the middle of the avenue, shining his light at his feet. He wasn't looking at the grand architecture. He was looking at the floor. In the center of the fused pavement, there was a depression. It was subtle, a shallow trough worn into the stone, about 4 feet wide. It meandered slightly, taking the path of least resistance between the buildings. "Doctor," Thomas called out softly. Thorne turned. "What is it? A structural flaw?" "No," Thomas said, kneeling down. He touched the depression. It was smooth, polished by friction. "It's a desire path." Thorne frowned. "A what?" "A walking path," Thomas explained. "You see it in hallways. The linoleum wears down in the center first. It takes millions of steps to wear down tile. But to wear down stone like this?" He looked up, his eyes wide behind the visor. "Millions of people walked here. For thousands of years. They commuted. They went to work." The team fell silent, staring at the groove in the floor. It changed everything. The windowless towers and the alien circuitry were cold and abstract, but the worn path was visceral. It spoke of routine. It spoke of a civilization that had lived its daily life in this darkness, marching in endless lines down this avenue, wearing away the stone with the soft, persistent rhythm of their existence. They weren't just exploring a machine anymore. They were walking in the footsteps of a ghost population. "We need to move," Thorne said, though his voice was gentler now, stripped of its clinical edge. "The main signal is coming from the center, directly under the rotunda." They followed the worn path. It led them past the endless rows of silent towers, deeper into the grid, until the buildings fell away. The avenue opened up into a vast circular plaza, and there, rising from the darkness, was the mirror. The structure that dominated the plaza was not a temple. It was an echo. As the team's floodlights swept up the curving, seamless walls, the shape became undeniable. It was a dome. A massive, sweeping hemisphere of black stone that sat in the center of the subterranean city like a dark heart. But where the Capitol dome above was white, soaring, and crowned with the Statue of Freedom reaching for the sky, this structure was grounded, heavy, and oppressive. It didn't reach up. It hunkered down, gripping the earth with a terrifying sense of permanence. It was a photographic negative of the building Thomas had spent half his life maintaining. The proportions were identical. The circumference of the base, the curve of the roof, the placement of the entrance. It all aligned perfectly with the rotunda 300 feet straight up. Thorne stood at the edge of the plaza, checking a digital survey tablet. He looked from the screen to the black dome, and for the first time, his hands shook visibly. He tapped the screen, overlaying the blueprints of the U.S. Capitol onto the LiDAR scan of the anomaly. The lines snapped together with a precision that was mathematical and chilling. The rotunda wasn't just sitting on top of this structure, it was perfectly concentric with it. "It's a capstone," Thorne said, his voice barely carrying over the static of the comms loop. He lowered the tablet, staring at the dark mass. The founding fathers, the architects, they didn't choose Jenkins Hill because of the view. They didn't choose it for the drainage. He pointed a gloved finger at the black dome. They chose it to cover this. The Capitol isn't a seat of government. It's a plug. It's a lid designed to seal this thing away from the surface. The implication hung in the sterile air. The history of the nation, the speeches, the laws, the tours, it was all a facade, a layer of white marble poured over a much older, darker reality to hide it from view. Thomas looked at the structure with a sudden, nauseating sense of vertigo. He felt as though the floor of the rotunda above might be made of glass, and at any moment the politicians and tourists might look down and see their dark reflection looking back. "We're going in," Thorne ordered. They approached the entrance. There were no grand stairs here, no ceremonial doors. There was only a tall, vertical slit in the curved wall, a breach that looked like a gill on a shark. It was open, revealing a corridor that swallowed the light of their headlamps instantly. Crossing the threshold was like stepping into a vacuum. The moment Thomas passed through the archway, the air pressure dropped. His ears popped violently. The silence inside was physical, a heavy woolen blanket that smothered the sound of their footsteps. The vast central hall opened up before them, a cavernous space that mirrored the rotunda in size but felt infinitely larger because of the shadows. Their lights struggled to reach the ceiling. The walls curved up into the gloom, smooth and unbroken by windows or galleries. But as they moved deeper into the chamber, the beams caught the edges of the perimeter. Standing in niches along the curved walls, where the statues of presidents and generals would be in the world above, were figures. Thomas stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He knew the statues upstairs. He knew the bronze folds of Garfield's coat, the marble brow of Washington, the rough texture of Lincoln's beard. He had dusted them 1,000 times. He knew them as silent, noble watchers. These figures were not noble. They were 12 feet tall, carved from the same light-absorbing stone as the building. They were humanoid, but the proportions were wrong. Their limbs were too long, their chests too broad. They wore robes that looked like rigid plating, etched with the same circuitry patterns as the exterior walls. But it was their faces that made Thomas step back. They didn't have faces. Where the eyes and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, blank surface, polished to a mirror sheen. And in their hands, they didn't hold scrolls or swords or the Constitution. They held tools, complex geometric shapes that looked like engine parts or weapons of unrecognizable function. One held a sphere surrounded by jagged rings. Another held a rod that terminated in a cluster of crystals. "They aren't leaders," a specialist whispered, her voice trembling as she scanned a statue with a spectrometer. "They're engineers. Or wardens." The team moved toward the center of the room, their boots clicking on a floor inlaid with gold lines that formed a massive, sprawling map. The atmosphere in the room was shifting. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was an energy. The Geiger counters, clipped to their belts, began to click. It started slowly, a rhythmic, lazy tick, tick, tick. But within seconds, the tempo increased. It wasn't radiation from a leak. It was background radiation from a source that was waking up. The electromagnetic field meters spiked, the needles burying themselves in the red. "Doctor," the lead technician said, his voice tight. "I'm getting a frequency reading. Extremely low band. It's coming from the floor. It's coming from the center." Thorne didn't stop. He was drawn toward the middle of the hall, toward the place where, in the world above, the tourists would be staring up at the fresco of George Washington. Here, there was something else, a focal point. The air grew warmer. The hair on Thomas's arms stood up, rubbing against the inside of his suit. He could feel a vibration in his teeth, a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate with the marrow of his bones. The dormant power of the city was concentrating here, in this inverted rotunda, and they were walking straight into the heart of the machine. They reached the center of the chamber. It wasn't empty. In the exact spot where the crypt sits in the Capitol above, the point designed to be the center of Washington, D.C., there was a platform here. A circular dais of obsidian raised 3 steps above the floor. On top of it sat a massive object that dominated the space. It wasn't an altar, and it wasn't a throne. It was a control surface. The table was 20 feet in diameter, forged from a metal that gleamed with a dull, bronze luster, despite the crushing darkness it had endured for thousands of years. It didn't look cast. It looked grown, the edges flowing organically into the stone floor. Thorne signaled the team to spread out, but he stepped up to the rim himself, wiping a layer of nothingness off the surface. The floodlights hit the metal, and the room seemed to ignite. The surface was etched with thousands of lines, thin as hairs, crisscrossing the bronze disc in a complex web. "It's a map," Thorne whispered, adjusting his glasses as he leaned in until his nose was inches from the metal. "But the geography. Look at the coastlines." Thomas stepped up beside him, staring at the shape of the landmass. He recognized the rough outline of North America, but it was swollen, distorted. Florida was twice its size, a thumb of land jutting deep into the ocean. The Mississippi River wasn't a river. It was a massive inland sea splitting the continent. "It's the continent," Thomas said. "But wrong." "Not wrong," Thorne corrected, his voice tight with a sudden, terrifying understanding. "Old. This is the coastline during the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, before the meltwater rose, before history began." He traced a line of gold inlay that ran from their location, marked by a diamond chip in the metal, to other points on the map. There were dozens of them, a web of light connecting nodes across the ancient world. One in the American Southwest, one near the Great Lakes, one buried deep under the ice of Antarctica. "We aren't looking at a city," Thorne said, straightening up, his face pale in the reflected light. "We're looking at a terminal. This wasn't a place where people lived. It was a place where they worked. This is a control hub for a global network." The realization shifted the ground beneath them. The secret city wasn't just a ruin under D.C. It was the capital of something that predates every history book in the Library of Congress. The Capitol above wasn't just built on a hill. It was built on the primary node of a planetary machine. While Thorne obsessed over the geography, Thomas's attention drifted to the center of the table. Lying there, seemingly discarded, was an object. It looked out of place against the cold, hard geometry of the room. It was small, rectangular, about the size of a standard tablet. He reached out. His glove hovered over it. "Don't touch it," a technician warned sharply. "It's pulsing," Thomas said. He didn't touch it, but he brought his hand close enough to feel the heat. The object wasn't stone or metal. It had a texture like leather, but smoother, organic. It looked like a book bound in a material that had never started to decay. And it was warm. In a room that had been freezing for millennia, this object was radiating the gentle, steady warmth of a living body. Thorne turned his attention to it, pulling a handheld scanner from his belt. He ran a beam over the surface of the object. Symbols projected onto his small screen, complex, interlocking geometric shapes that defied immediate translation. Thorne froze. He tapped the screen, bringing up a reference database, overlaying the symbols with historical ciphers. "Impossible," he breathed. "What is it?" Thomas asked, the dread rising in his throat. "These symbols," Thorne pointed to the screen, his hand shaking. "They have a root structure identical to early Masonic ciphers. And look here, this glyph. It appears in the private journals of Benjamin Franklin. It appears in the cornerstone ceremonies of the 1790s. He looked up at Thomas, eyes wide. They knew. The founding fathers didn't just find this place. They studied it. They tried to translate it. The layout of Washington, D.C., the avenues, the circles, they aren't based on L'Enfant's genius. They're based on this map. They built the city above to mirror the machine below. It was a staggering thought. The entire history of the American experiment wasn't just about democracy. It was about guardianship. They had built a fortress of government to protect the entrance to this, whatever this was. But the machine didn't care about their realizations. It only cared about their presence. The hum that had been vibrating in Thomas's teeth suddenly changed pitch. It shifted from a low thrum to a rising whine, like a turbine spinning up to speed. The gold lines on the map table began to glow, not from reflected light, but from within. A soft, amber luminescence bled up through the metal, casting long, moving shadows against the statues. "Energy spike!" the technician at the perimeter yelled, backing away from the wall. "EM field is expanding! It's waking up!" The floor beneath them jolted. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a mechanical engagement. The sensation of massive gears, miles deep in the earth, finally catching their teeth after centuries of idle stillness. Dust, the first dust they had seen, shook loose from the high darkness of the ceiling. Thorne grabbed the edge of the map table to steady himself. "We triggered a proximity sensor," he shouted over the rising sound. "The heat! The CO2! It knows we're here!" The warm, book-like object in the center of the table flared bright red. The symbols on its surface rearranged themselves, shifting and sliding like liquid mercury. It wasn't a book. It was an interface. And it was waiting for a command. "Doctor, we need to leave," the security lead barked, his hand on his weapon. "The structural integrity is failing." "It's not failing," Thorne yelled back, staring at the map as the nodes began to blink in sequence. "It's booting up." The vibration became violent. The statues along the wall seemed to lean forward. The air pressure in the room plummeted, sucking the breath from their lungs even through the respirators. The darkness at the top of the dome began to swirl, a vortex of gray mist forming where there should have been stone. Thomas looked at the map one last time. The light was traveling from the other nodes, racing along the gold lines, converging on their location. The network was calling home. And they were standing in the receiver. The shift happened in the space between heartbeats. The amber glow that had washed over the map table didn't fade. It deepened, curdling instantly into a bruised, violent crimson. It wasn't just a change in lighting. It was a change in the state of matter within the room. The air, previously cold and stagnant, suddenly felt hot and charged, smelling of ozone and scorched copper. The monitors on the team's equipment didn't just glitch. They screamed, their screens flooding with error messages before shattering inward, the glass cracking under a sudden, crushing spike in atmospheric pressure. Thorne didn't need to check his instruments to know what was happening. The city wasn't just waking up. It was reacting to an infection. And they were the virus. "Move!" Thorne's voice tore through the comms, distorted by the rising electromagnetic interference. "Everyone, back to the breach, now!" The team didn't argue. The professional curiosity that had driven them down into the dark evaporated, replaced instantly by the primal, lizard-brain urge to survive. They turned and ran. The run back across the polished floor of the central hall was a nightmare of shifting perspectives. The statues along the walls, those faceless giants holding their incomprehensible tools, seemed to turn as the team sprinted past. In the strobing red light, their shadows stretched and snapped like rubber bands, grasping at the fleeing figures. The floor beneath their boots wasn't solid anymore. It hummed with a vibration so intense it blurred their vision, making the exit archway look like it was drifting sideways. Thomas scrambled after the soldiers, his breath ragged in the respirator. He risked a single glance back at the center of the room. The map table was gone, swallowed by a column of spiraling energy that reached from the floor to the apex of the dome. It was a cyclone of light, silent and terrifying. And it was widening. They burst through the archway and out into the plaza. The silence of the subterranean city had been shattered. The deep, rhythmic thrum they had felt earlier had escalated into a continuous, deafening roar that seemed to come from the bedrock itself. But the most terrifying change was the city skyline. The windowless towers were no longer dark. Thin, vertical lines of red light had ignited on every building, pulsing in unison. It looked like the circuitry of a massive computer processing a termination command. "The geometry!" Thorne yelled, pointing toward the avenue they had used to enter. "It's shifting!" He was right. The wide, straight avenue was closing. The massive buildings on either side were moving, sliding noiselessly across the frictionless stone floor. The street was narrowing, the gap between the structures closing like a sliding door. They were trying to seal the path to the surface. "Sprint!" the security lead roared. "Go! Go!" They ran. The heavy suits felt like lead weights. Thomas's lungs burned. He focused on the back of the man in front of him, forcing his legs to pump, his boots slamming against the stone. The walls of the buildings loomed closer with every second. 10 feet apart, 8 feet. The path was becoming a corridor, then a hallway, then a squeeze. They were running through a canyon that was actively trying to crush them. The air grew hotter, the temperature spiking 20 degrees in seconds. The ventilation grates in the ground hissed, venting steam that smelled of ancient chemicals. Thomas stumbled, his boot catching on the lip of a grate. He went down hard, his hands scraping against the stone. "Get up!" Thorne grabbed his harness, hauling him to his feet with a strength born of panic. "Don't look at the walls." They cleared the avenue just as the buildings slammed together behind them, with a sound like a thunderclap, sealing the path into a solid wall of black stone. They were at the base of the tower now, staring up at the metal gantry that hung from the hole in the Capitol's foundation, their only lifeline back to the world of the living. They scrambled up the ancient stone stairs, boots slipping on the smooth treads. The gantry was shaking violently, the metal rattling against the stone ledge. The first technician hit the grate and scrambled up. Then the second. Thomas was third. He hauled himself onto the metal walkway, the vibration rattling his teeth. Below them, the city was dissolving into light. The red glow was becoming blinding, washing out the shadows, erasing the details. The darkness wasn't just retreating. It was being burned away by the ignition of the machine. "The breach!" Thorne screamed from behind him. "It's closing!" Thomas looked up. The rectangular hole they had cut through the brick, the doorway to the sub-basement, was shrinking. Not because the brick was moving, but because the ancient black stone behind it was growing. It flowed like thick tar, oozing from the edges of the cut, knitting itself back together with fluid, organic grace. It was healing the wound they had made. "Faster!" Thomas yelled, pushing the man in front of him. They threw themselves through the gap. One by one, they tumbled out of the alien atmosphere and onto the cold, wet concrete of the Capitol sub-basement. Thomas hit the floor and rolled, tearing his mask off, gasping for the stale, dusty air of the modern world. Thorne was the last one through. He dove through the opening just as the black substance surged across the gap. There was no sound of stone hitting stone, just a soft, wet thwip as the ancient wall sealed itself completely. The hole was gone. Where there had been a view into a city of giants, there was now only the back of the rough, red brick wall of the foundation. The vibration stopped instantly. The red light vanished. The roar cut out as if a speaker wire had been slashed. They lay there in the dim hallway, a pile of heaving chests and terrified eyes, surrounded by the hum of the HVAC system and the smell of floor wax. The silence of the Capitol returned, heavy and indifferent, as if nothing had happened at all. But Thomas, lying on his back and staring at the ceiling, could still feel the heat radiating from the wall. The basement was quiet, but he knew, with a certainty that made his blood run cold, that the thing on the other side was no longer sleeping. It was waiting. The hallway didn't remain empty for long. The retreat from the impossible was immediately replaced by the cold, hard efficiency of containment. Within minutes, a secondary team arrived, setting up a decontamination airlock at the end of the corridor. They stripped Thomas and the specialists of their suits, sealing the gear into biohazard bags with a heavy, final zip that sounded like a body bag closing. The air, which had just moments ago smelled of ozone and ancient lightning, was scrubbed clean by the sharp chemical sting of industrial bleach. Thorne stood by the elevator, his face gray, wiping a smear of black dust from his cheek. He didn't look like an explorer anymore. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash. He watched as his team loaded the shattered monitors and the fried sensor arrays back into the Pelican cases. There was no debriefing in the hallway, no excitement, just the hurried, terrified packing of people who wanted to be anywhere else. When Thorne finally turned to Thomas, his eyes were hard, stripped of the curiosity they had held an hour ago. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply handed Thomas a clipboard with a single sheet of paper. "Structural failure in the steam tunnels," Thorne said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "That's what happened. You found a leak. We fixed it. The fumes caused hallucinations." Thomas looked at the paper. It was a non-disclosure agreement, but it was thicker than the standard government forms. The header didn't list a department. It just listed a penal code for treason. "I saw it," Thomas whispered, his hands still trembling. "I saw the map." "You saw nothing." Thorne stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more dangerous than a shout. "You saw a gas leak. Because if you saw anything else, Thomas, if you saw a machine that uses this continent as a circuit board, then you become a loose end. And these people," he gestured vaguely to the ceiling, to the government above, "they don't like loose ends. They like silence." Thomas signed. He didn't have a choice. The weight of the pen felt heavier than the sledgehammer he used to break the wall. By dawn, the specialists were gone. The black SUVs vanished into the DC traffic, reabsorbed by the city as if they had never existed. In their place came a different crew. These men didn't wear hazmat suits. They wore canvas work clothes. They were masons. They didn't ask why there was a hole in the foundation. They simply mixed their mortar, stacked new red clay bricks into the gap, and sealed the wound. They worked with a rhythmic scraping sound, scrape, slap, stack, that buried the ancient black stone behind a layer of fresh, modern normalcy. Within 3 hours, the wall was whole again. They even painted it white to match the surrounding corridor. Thomas was back on his shift the next night. The supervisor didn't mention the incident. The security guards, Miller and Jenkins, wouldn't meet his eyes. They stood at their posts, staring straight ahead, pretending the yellow tape had never been there. The building had reset itself. The gas leak memo had been circulated, accepted, and filed away. But for Thomas, the building had changed. He walked the sub-basement corridor with his mop bucket, the wheels squeaking on the linoleum. It was the same sound as always, but now it felt small. He stopped at the spot where the breach had been. The paint was fresh, smelling of latex. a thin, fragile skin trying to hide a deep infection. He realized then that the Capitol wasn't a fortress. It wasn't the seat of power. It was a facade. The marble columns, the statues, the laws being passed in the chambers above, they were all just a performance to distract from the reality below. The politicians thought they were steering the ship of state, but they were just passengers sitting on the lid of an engine they couldn't comprehend. He placed his hand on the fresh white paint. He closed his eyes. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A low, steady vibration traveled through the new brick, through his palm, and into his bones. It wasn't the hum of the HVAC. It wasn't the subway. It was the rhythm of the city below, waiting in the dark. It hadn't gone back to sleep. It was listening. And Thomas, standing alone in the fluorescent light, knew that he would never know silence again. We walk on concrete and asphalt, assuming the earth beneath us is solid and dumb. We assume history is a straight line that we have fully mapped. But sometimes the map tears, and we see the gears turning underneath. The Capitol still stands, but the vibration in the basement floor never truly stops. If you want to know what other secrets are buried under your feet, watch this video next. Subscribe for the truth the blueprints leave out.